Dan, how would you describe yourself? What's been your intellectual trajectory?
My trajectory has been to some extent driven by events, but I would say that I started out with a strong alignment, shall we say, with various strands of radical theory, and moved into questions of first communications and then information as time went on. I have moved across the years from all sorts of departments to others. There's been no rhyme nor reason to it if you looked at it in terms of a CV. I was in radio, TV, film at Temple University in the 1970s, and then in, library and information science at UCLA. And then I moved to communication at UCSD when I met you. And then back into library and information science and communication. So I've been across these boundaries, and I think that in terms of your question, the big point would be that rather than being bound to conceptions of information processing functions that are limited around, let's say, propagandistic concerns or concerns about the effects of media on people, I have progressively, as I see it, broadened my concern outward to other functions of information in society, including particularly political economic functions. So how it is that information processing has become such a really vast economic undertaking in the society, and what kinds of political and even cultural features that has had. I'm not sure that that's not pitched at an entirely inappropriate level of abstraction, but you can be the judge.
Good. When we first met in 1999 at a symposium, first one I think ever held on the political economy of the internet, and it included a lot of the early illuminati of the
Yes.
of the business. Like, for example, I remember Vince Cerf was there,
Yes.
and Craig Mundy and John Perry Barlow.
Mm-hmm.
And a whole raft of other people, okay? But as far as I could see, you were the only political economist there, as it were. But the point for me was that I was, as most of those people then were, and maybe still are, a kind of a techno-utopian. And you were the first non-utopian I ever met. And what struck me very, what interested me most was the fact that your take on the internet was that it should be seen in the context of what had happened to the telecommunications industry over the last previous 20 or 25 years. Is that right?
Well, it's right in a sense that's probably a bit iconoclastic. It's right in that my sense is that the telecommunications industry is the proper sector over which to overlay the internet as a process of construction. But the telecommunications industry has typically been seen as comprising suppliers only. And I have worked against that from the very beginning of my engagement with the field of telecommunications, so that you need to have users as well as suppliers to make an industry. And I'm speaking here not so much of individual users, though I would make the same point with respect to them, but of business users, organizational users, who account for the lion's share of demand for telecommunication services of every kind. And so the internet, I thought, needed to be seen in that context. And in fact, I heard Vince Cerf speak on a different occasion where he attributed, and he didn't give a reference, would have been somewhere in the mid to late 90s, that internet spending was 90% corporate and 10% consumer. And so it seemed to me that that provided instant affirmation of the view that I was in any case committed to, and brought to that discussion. Because business users have been a powerful force, not only in the more microscopic processes of construction, as David Hari might call them, but also in the political side. And in my early work, the the role of business users as a political force was decisive in producing what we call liberalization of telecommunications. And the internet is the kind of consummate expression of that tendency, in my view.
But at that time, I mean, most of the people who were involved in the early internet, if you think of the network as being like all technology, something that is socially constructed,
Yes.
then you can divide the history of the net into two 20-year tranches in a way. The first one is from 73 to 93, say, when it was, for example, it was totally non-commercial, there were no companies in it. It was comprised largely of people who did not work in the corporate sector. It connected basically elite research labs in various places, and it was used mostly by people who knew one another or knew their affiliations, and so it was a space which was like a parallel universe to the sordid world of telecommunications policy and so on. That was the way it was perceived, and also, I mean, if you think of the narrative about the net in its early days, which was that when Paul Baran, one of the co-inventors of packet switching, when he came up with that idea, he then spent some time, many months, banging his head on a brick wall called AT&T, the dominant monopolistic phone supplier, which basically didn't want to believe, or perhaps did believe, but was in denial about the viability of digital packet switching. Is that right? I mean, so that's why it seemed very strange to meet somebody who was coming at this from the AT&T side.
I mean, I think the sense that I have is that any system has its political economy, and the question is, what does it look like? So it's not so much that one suspends that assumption with respect to the internet. And I should be a little bit more careful here to say that there are genuine features of internet communicativeness that lend themselves to things that don't fall under the prevailing structures of power, and that's a good thing in my opinion. But to make that the determining feature of the system is the thing that I think you're correctly sensing I was not willing to do. Because my assumption is that the political economy is there, one needs simply to find it. And it has the right, if I might say this, to look however it looks. It doesn't have to reduce down to some previously known formation. And in some ways the internet is still baffling us in that particular respect. In fact, we call the internet something that doesn't really look like what we called the internet 10 years ago. So, I'm not sure where I want to go with that, but in terms of your earlier point about AT&T, I go back and forth on this. There's a lot of people often think that AT&T was simply being short-sighted or stupid, and they cite the reference going back a century earlier of Western Union having said to the patent holder on the Bell patents, "Oh no, we're not interested in that." Well, the Western Union episode turns out to be incorrect as a description of what happened. And the one with AT&T and packet switching, I go back and forth on because, from the point of view of a company that commanded the largest capital on earth of any single company, and which had unbelievable political power at the same time in Washington, and with foreign correspondence. I mean, it was involved with the PTTs in countries all over the world, the postal, telephone, telegraph ministries. So it was really almost unsurpassed. And from their perspective, to look at packet switching, I don't think it should be thought of perhaps only in terms of whether the technology might be made to work. The question was also, how significant is this going to be in any meaningful time frame?
Yeah.
Can I go on with this for a second?
No, that's good.
There's a very fascinating thing, which was the substrate in a way for my feeling. I was at a conference on telecommunications in 1982 or 83 in Washington, D.C., and the then chairman of AT&T was the keynote speaker, Charles Brown. He took live questions, which was remarkable. I mean, he didn't insist that everything be scripted. And in a way, that's also indicative of his sense of confidence of his organization and of himself. And somebody challenged him This was at a time of, you'll remember, high inflation. And somebody said, well, you know, AT&T was authorized to earn a rate of return, because that was the old way we used to do it, of 12.5%, and you earned 13.25%. What do you propose to do about that? And he didn't miss a beat. He said, well, you know, when we miss our authorized rate of return, nobody's coming to us and saying, how can we make up the difference? But he said, but in any case, we're talking $300 million. That's wine for the salad. That was his phrase. So that gives me some sense of what their sense of viable stakes or meaningful stakes would be.
It may also, but the other thing about this funny perspective that you get if you come from the internet world purely,
yes.
and you look at the telecoms world is. If you think of the network as being essentially having three layers, at the top layer is the content, the stuff that everybody worries about, and at the intermediate level are the protocols, TCP, IP, and all the other things that make it work, and then down below there's a physical layer.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
And everything that happens on the net runs on the physical layer as well, and the physical layer is run and owned almost exclusively by telecoms companies, or it was then by telecoms companies.
Yes, there are many, many implications that come from this that
They
are
own the pipes.
They rarely considered. But for example, when there was the earthquake that was centered somewhere off Taiwan a few years ago, it massively devastated internet access in China. For I think something like 6 weeks, there was difficulty in restoring it. So that's a particularly significant example of what can follow from ignoring the physicality of the internet or of the system of which the internet, on which it sits. But there are others. So for example, I don't know what the status, if there is really a status, of the net neutrality debate is here in Britain. But in the United States, there is kind of an ongoing, it's not so much a debate as bouts of panic that come from the people who are ardent enthusiasts for net neutrality, which I share the goal, but I don't want to turn it into a be-all and an end-all in itself. But the net neutrality issue is, in some respects, about the terms of trade between the telecommunications industry and the content companies. And the content companies have been very, very quick to perceive that they can win a much wider following if they can support a kind of politicization of the issue to accommodate their interests. On the other hand, those same content companies, led by Google, have gone far into diversifying into the pipes.
Yeah.
Google owns a huge submarine cable network, as well as having local fiber optics in much of the United States now, increasing number of cities.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they're on the one hand protecting themselves through making that investment, on the other hand driving as hard a terms of trade negotiation as they can through the net neutrality debate.
We can ask a question.
Yes, please.
So what, that history, which I'm a total outsider to that history, from the techno-utopians and having a conference on the political economy of the internet where there's only one person who actually does political economy and everyone else just dreams. At what point did the corporate players become self-aware about their power in this? I mean, when did they, to the extent that they are at all, even to this
About
day,
what then become
self-conscious of the extent to which the sort of surface story of what's going on here isn't the real story, and there is an underlying economic story that you could see. So you could see from the outside the extent of the...
I think that's an interesting question. I don't know fully the answer, but I think we were talking last night, John and I, about, or I guess it was this morning, Eric Schmidt.
Yeah.
And when Eric Schmidt was given to take over Google for a time, one might say that the political awareness was deepened significantly.
Right.
And
that was what he came for.
And so, I mean, but with Facebook, you know, Zuckerberg seems to me to be a smart guy, although not a particularly nice man. But so what? But he in the press that I've been reading, he's being taught Mandarin so that he can have a minute-long conversation with Xi Jinping, as he did just a few days ago.
Wow.
And that's interesting because they're not allowed. Facebook's not allowed in China. So, but nevertheless, he's learning Mandarin. That to me, he may be, of course, misguided, but his own sense of there being a political reality that he needs to react to is significant. It's not really that much different, if I might say so, without causing a difficulty for Rupert Murdoch to have had a Chinese wife for a time.
We won't go into that. But I mean, what always infuriates you about geeks, I think, is that they don't think politics matters. Is that?
No, I think one of the things that infuriates me is they talk about ethics as though that was politics.
Uh-huh.
We were John and I were talking about and recent experience
Yeah.
of this. The guy who helped set up DeepMind, there was an event in Cambridge last week, and he was asked by someone, "What about the ethics of this?" And he said, "It's funny. Google has set up an ethics commission, and that's covered." But the idea that there was also a politics to the ethics of it was way off his radar. And so part of it is the extent to which that you can see the politics running through this, but it's never clear to me the extent to which the players who are themselves exercising the political power know the extent of their power, have thought about the ways in which they should calibrate it.
Yes.
I mean, it is, like you say, it's a mystery to a lot of us.
Yeah. Well,
and it's probably a mystery to the people who are running it.
It may be in some ways to them as well, but I mean, I think there's really a lot to be dug into on this. I mean, for example, the traffic back and forth between the tech industry and the State Department of the United States. There's personnel shifts. There's people who have stood service in both places, and there's some coordination. I mean, I think it's quite interesting. I haven't actually looked. Hillary Clinton's emails are now more and more becoming available as a result of her ill thought through decision to use a private server, and so. I'm not sure if there's however many tens of thousands of emails. If any of them detail the moments when Google pulled out of China. But I think it would be very interesting to look for evidence there, if there is any to be found, because, there was a very carefully designed internet freedom, net freedom initiative undertaken by the State Department in the immediate aftermath of that. And it really looks like a 1-2 punch. So one wants to sort of ask about the politics going beyond the ethics. I mean, as much as anyone, I want to have freedom of communication.
I'm not saying ethics don't matter.
I took your point. Of course they matter, but it's a different issue.
It can't substitute for everything.
So,
but just on that point, I mean, for example, we had a really good seminar here by Mike Osborne from Oxford, who was one of the pair that did this very good investigation of the possible impact of advanced robotics and machine learning and so on middle class employment. Mm-hmm. Terrific seminar and the rest of it. But to us sitting there listening to it, the first thing that comes across is the thought that if these predictions are even partly right, in other words, if this technology is going to have a devastating impact or a serious impact on middle class jobs in the next 2 decades, then dealing with the fallout from that has to be a political question.
Absolutely.
And yet, nowhere in this discussion in general among the machine learning community, for example, is it. It's almost as if they think that may be true, but it's none of our business really.
Or they might well think we'll leave it to other people who are the experts at that.
Right.
And that's the other vice of this, which is the assumption that expertise simply maps across these different spaces. So surely there's someone who can solve that problem in the way that we've solved this one.
No, I quite agree.
Doesn't work like that. Yeah.
The sense of a democratic process falls away.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
We can't have that. So what then do we do?
But if you then want to take that and apply it to a different case, nothing to do with employment or work, but you take, say, the question of how does one somehow conceptualize the kinds of power that these big internet companies now wield. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that preoccupies us is finding a way of encapsulating and describing the nature of that power. So if you take Google, say, which is the most prominent case probably at
Yeah,
the
yeah.
moment. Well, it's absolutely clear that in at least one of the things that it does, that's to say search, Google is a monopoly to end all monopolies. I don't know what the figures are in the States, but for example in Europe, Google has about 95% of the search
It's
market.
lower in the States.
Okay, but that's
Not that
interesting.
much, but
Yeah,
it's-
yeah, but I mean, normally in the old days we would say, well, that's definitely monopoly
Oh,
power,
yes,
okay,
absolutely.
and therefore we need to investigate it.
Yes.
And then what happens? Well, in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission investigates, and according to what I regard as reliable reports, its staff concluded that Google was in fact abusing its monopoly power in this area, but the FTC backed off. It didn't do anything about it. Across this side of the Atlantic, you have the European Commission investigating the same thing, which is Google abusing its monopoly in search in order to disadvantage some companies that compete in areas that it also competes in. The European Commission has a staff. It does its research. My understanding is that that research was that the FTC staffers shared their research with Google. And what happens with the Europeans, and then what happens on this side of the Atlantic is that the European Commission says, yeah, okay, there is something here, and it poses a set of questions that Google has to answer, and that process is now going on, and it could well lead to antitrust action against Google. And so, first of all, you say, well, the same facts did not lead to that conclusion in the United States as here. So what's the difference? And there you say, well, one possible difference is that Google has really ramped up its political lobbying in the US. And once upon a time, Google didn't think it was worth lobbying anybody, but boy, did that change after Schmidt became CEO. So that's one possible explanation. That's the kind of conspiracy theory explanation. There's a conspiracy theory explanation on the European side as well, which is that there are a lot of big companies in Europe which don't like the success of American companies. For example, think of Springer, big German publisher.
Springer's one of them.
They always loathe Google and so on. So that's one side of it. Another side of it is European politicians who can't stand the idea that Europe has not been able to generate its own good big search engine. So it could be some kind of it could be that old style kind of politics. First of all, becomes a dimension to this discussion about the power of a single internet company. But then you have a second. But at least we understand monopoly power. It's an old idea. Or so one thinks, because the United States had the Sherman Act and all the other stuff that the trust busting stuff from the early years of the 20th century and so on. So it looked for a time as if that in the case of Google that we have a form of power that we understand. It's monopoly power, and we can do something about it, maybe. Okay. Then there are some arguments we discover in the United States, coming from Robert Bork and others, which say, actually things have changed with digital technology, because it may be that if a company is truly dominant in its field, that's not a reason for concern, it's a reason to celebrate. Because it's a sign of excellence. So fierce old-style antitrust attitudes to these kind of companies is actually, you're punishing excellence rather than the wicked. Do you know what I mean? So,
Yeah, no, I mean, these are powerful kinds of arguments. I mean, I just think that there should be more, appreciation of the political dimension of these things than there tends to be. So as more a complement to some of the points you've just made, Google hasn't only ramped up its lobbying in the United States, it's beefed up its EU lobbying very considerably. And the other big Silicon Valley companies have as well. So that explanation that they can't get quite as far in Europe as they do in the United States because it's somehow not home ground is a little bit, it's tempered by it. And on the other hand, some of the European complaints originate in subsidiaries or allies of Microsoft and of other Google competitors. So, I mean, it doesn't reduce exactly to national frameworks in that sense. There are other dimensions of this, the processes that you're talking about. I mean, I think we often act as if the market activities of a company come to us free of a political substrate or of um, entanglements. And I would dispute that, I mean, in all sorts of ways. So, for example, the very fact that there is this ability of a Google or of a Facebook to work as if there is no relevance of physical pipes, that's because of political decisions. It's not because of somehow sacrosanct market definitions. And so we can suspend that, and I think we should, for understanding how they work with one another in any kind of context where it's about trying to preserve advantage. One final point, which I think is in a way decisive. Again, returning to my thought that it's not only about a limited, however powerful, limited band of supply companies, but about the interactions in which those suppliers are embedded. The markets, if you will, but politically constituted markets. The current frontier of digitization goes way beyond the things that we are right now seeing, as your question about employment actually already takes for granted. And I think for that reason, the concern that European companies have expressed, some of them, I'll mention this in our talk tomorrow, so I don't want to say too much about it, but that not only media companies, but other high-tech companies in Europe have been concerned. You take the question of basically software-controlled cars. Okay, software-controlled cars vault this discussion into an entirely different dimension. We're not just talking about search. We're talking about who captures the lion's share of the profit from the next generation and the generation after that of digitized or digitally enabled systems. And so, in a certain sense, the action that might be taken, and who knows what will happen, I'm not trying to prejudge it, I have no way of knowing, but the action that might be taken by the European Union in this context would be laying down a marker and saying, no matter what, you're going to have to be cognizant of the need to broker deals going forward, rather than to just take it as you like. Google has, I think, not Google alone, but the US internet companies, and Google preeminent among them, have taken 60% of the electronic advertising in Germany. That includes non-internet advertising. So, I mean, the German companies are quite rightly dismayed about that. And they're using the very same kinds of tools that any company in any developed capitalist country or even in less developed countries would use, which is to go to the state and say, help.
And do you think the state is equipped now for this? I mean, if we make these historical comparisons with past monopolies and so on, are the analogies sound or not?
I don't really know the answer to that in the case of the EU. I mean, you know something about the staff there and how big the budgets are, I presume. You know, there does need to be a considerable commitment made to build up expertise and to have people who really know. And again, if I might go back to the history, in the United States, the period from around the very end of World War I, and it even originated earlier than that, through around the 1940s or so, was chock-a-block with people developing expertise about the telecommunications industry, and often, because it was the Depression and then World War II for much of that period, fired by a reform ethos and saying it's not enough for the prevailing realities to govern what should happen in the future. We have to be concerned about such things as employment. There was tremendous concern about unemployment during the Depression at the hands of AT&T because they laid off telephone operators. And you know, any further increment of unemployment when you had 25% in 1932 of unemployment was unacceptable. I mean, politically unacceptable to large numbers of people. So without turning it into simply an instrumental fact, the reform affinities of many of the people who became regulators were considerable, and they really knew stuff. I mean, they knew, how do you measure the rate base? You could spend your whole life working on these, you know, almost ineffable calculations about, well, how do we value this line item in the rate base versus that? And there were, you know, a couple of generations of regulators who did that. And, it's not my cup of tea, but I'm glad there were people whose it was.
But that, sorry,
No, you go.
but because the chilling thought is always that in that part of the story from the First World War through the Depression to the Second World War, it was those events that created the state capacity to rise to the scale of the problems. So now we're trying to do it, presumably, in the absence of those kinds of events. I know we've had you might want to call it a depression, but we've had a downturn, which not quite on the scale of the 30s on some measures, more than on others. But what we don't have are the wars. I mean, that's the, if on that old cliche that wars make states and states make wars.
Yes.
If wars make state capacity, we do. I think we're really struggling to work out how you tool states up in the absence of that kind of challenge.
I don't think there's a one-dimensional explanation, but I do think that you think about these issues from wherever you are, and where we all are is in universities to some extent. Universities need to be able to talk in much more, thorough and honest ways about the needs that exist in a civic sense for students to take seriously these kinds of responsibilities. And look, I've been a teacher for my whole life, so I know very well how difficult it is when people are inclined more towards whatever Wall Street or whatever it would be, as they so often are. But there's enough that you can reach some and occasionally have a success, and I think we should be more concerned about that, because we can actually do something about that. It's not enough, but it is something. And I don't know, in the longer view,
we can't wait for the next war. That's for sure.
We can't wait for the next war.
That's not a good strategy for dealing with.
I know, it's too frightening, but I think having, who knows about the next war? I'm worried about the South China Sea, but you have the occasional individual who makes a huge difference. There was a guy who was a state public utilities commissioner in Oklahoma in the early 1920s. Oklahoma? The early 1920s? The chances of this individual exerting powerful effects over the shape of American telecommunications policy, if you cut into the picture when he was a state regulator in the 1920s, would look infinitesimal. And yet this guy, he failed. But it was an honorable defeat. He failed in subjecting the then monopolist AT&T to the sort of thoroughgoing regulatory oversight that could have been exercised and should, in my opinion, have been exercised. But he brought it to the attention of Washington, D.C. He became the Federal Communications Commissioner with chief responsibility for the issue, and he really.
Sorry. Keep going. This is a great story.
He really had an impact.
Yeah.
His name was Paul Walker, just for the record, and nobody remembers him today. But this guy, he played an incredibly important role, because there were all kinds of, just to go on, there were all kinds of tensions between state and federal regulators, for example, in the United States context. We have a federal system, so the proper jurisdiction of the one versus the other is always up for grabs, or it was. And Paul Walker was the one of the FCC, so he had been a state regulator. He'd been at the forefront of the movement for state regulation. No state regulator could fault him for not being sensitive to the realities at the state level. He brought them with him to Washington when he became a Federal Communications Commissioner. And then he took pains when he initiated the most important inquiry that was ever undertaken into AT&T as a corporation in 1935. As a Federal Communications Commissioner. And I should tell you, the FCC was created in 1934, so it was one of the originating acts of the FCC. He made sure that he kept the whole state regulator structure mindful of what was going on. He shared reports, he had briefings, he never tried to say, we know better than you. He tried to say, let's work together on problems that can only be solved by us working together. And so, I think a few people who are sensitized. Like you mentioned Tim Wu earlier, and I've actually never met Tim Wu, so I don't know. I'll suspend judgment in a final way until that
Sure.
time should come. But he seems to me to be somebody who might qualify for such a role. I mean,
Yeah.
he's really a knowledgeable guy, and he's got a kind of an expansive intelligence that's always asking questions that lie a little beyond where he presently sits, and that's a good beginning.
And interestingly, he also tried, alas unsuccessfully, to run for public office in New York. But just mentioning Tim Wu reminds me of AT&T again for a moment, and then Google, because in Tim Wu's book, The Master Switch, which is a history of the communications industries in the United States in the 20th century, there's a remarkable story about which illustrates the power of a monopoly, and this was the discovery that sometime in the mid-30s, a researcher at Bell Labs, which was the great research lab funded by AT&T's huge revenues, he invented the telephone answering machine, but in order to do that, he had to invent a way of recording audio signals onto some medium, and he did so with magnetized iron filings and all the rest of it. In other words, he invented the storage technology that eventually enabled many decades later the computer industry to grow. Because if you still have a hard drive in your computer, it uses the same technology as this guy invented in Bell Labs. Okay, what happened? Well, what happened is that in a regular reporting session, this invention of the answering machine was revealed to the owners of Bell Labs, or AT&T, which is a telephone company, and they concluded that if it became widely known to the American public that it would be possible to record telephone conversations, then that would really have a bad effect on their market, for all kinds of reasons, good, bad, and indifferent. And so they decided that basically this should be squashed. Nobody should know about it. It should disappear from the record. It should be airbrushed out of history, and so on. Okay, so there you have and it was in a position to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so there you have a company which has monopoly power and which essentially has the capacity to hold back the future.
A future.
A future. That's true. The question is, can you apply that kind of warning story to, say, the modern monopolies like Google?
Well, I want to be on both sides of this, because while there's absolutely no doubt that AT&T would and did suppress inventions when it seemed in its interest to do so under the old regime, it tends, as a bit of rhetoric, shall we say, to invoke that kind of action, to pull us back into that very small band of suppliers framework that I think is inadequate for explaining the processes at work in many cases. So in any given case, yes, it may be that exactly that happened, and it's not to the interest of the larger population that it should have happened. However, I would want to insist that the story be told in such a way as to expand outward to other actors, in particular business users.
Yeah.
And I think that still is true today.
And in defense of AT&T, you could tell another story from which is that it's also in Bell Labs that Shockley and Bardeen and co. invent the transistor.
Yes, but that needs to be qualified as well. I mean, I'm glad we're talking about telecommunications history, because it is my passion, and that's what I've spent much of my life working on. But that story is a really interesting story that's not even now been fully told, the story of the transistor. The whole thing grew out of World War II military electronics and radar and the MIT Rad Lab and some other things. And at the end of the Second World War, this is something I filed Freedom of Information Act requests on, and so I have some sense of at least what you can get that way. If you're interested, I'll tell you boring stories over dinner about the background of that. But the other big companies in electronics in the period of 1945, 1946, 1947 were intent that AT&T should not do with the unfolding technologies that would be built around microelectronics or anything having to do with military electronics, what it had done before and threatened to do around telephone, telegraph, and radio. And AT&T had been kicked out of radio in the late 20s, early 30s. It's not remembered. It was under the Hoover administration.
And this was on antitrust grounds, or?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And the companies who had been most concerned, General Electric, Westinghouse, big companies in their own right. And these companies and others as well, some of whom were newer, fledgling companies, got into military electronics in the war, were absolutely, so going back to your question about how cognizant politically are the companies, these companies were very mindful that the only thing that could prevent AT&T from playing an even more formidable role than it was going to play, clearly, would be intervention. And so there's a very interesting story. The first antitrust case, or I shouldn't say the first, but in the post-World War II period, the first, is not the one that broke up the company that was originated in the 70s under the Nixon administration, the Ford administration. It was an investigation that was originated under the Truman administration in 1949. But it had been prepared, the grounds for it had been prepared going back to as far as 1939, 1940. It's a New Deal thing that gets carried forward in the very different framework of 1949, because these other big companies said we have to have a way of constraining AT&T. And that case lasted from 1949 to 1956. And it needs to be understood that, Truman lost the 1952 election, and Eisenhower did not immediately basically capitulate and say to AT&T, do what you want. The case was a scandal in the eyes of many liberals because it handed, they thought, AT&T almost a total victory in 1956. But it didn't. In my opinion, that's a misreading, because what it did do was to say that any patents that the AT&T company had attained using government money, which was to say, because it was all sort of lopped together in Bell Labs, all of them had to be made available at nominal charge to anybody. Okay. And that is a big part of the reason that we got not just any one technology, but any and all, from cellular phones to the internet.
Okay. Well, again, as an outsider, so what's one of the things so fascinating about the couple of stories you just told is we have the conventional lay view that is promoted by the tech industry, where you have big lumbering repressive states, and then one or two guys in a garage kind of being entrepreneurial, and you've just turned it on its head both ways. So we have the entrepreneurial civil servant, the guy in Oklahoma in his garage, and you have the big lumbering corporate monopolists doing the suppression. And I know there are various people who want to tell that kind of story, that states are more nimble and corporate players less so, but that's a really striking version of it, particularly the kind of need for the entrepreneurial regulator.
Yes, and the thing is,
the lone regulator taking on the...
Well, not even alone, but we can create such people. We can give, there are such people, and what we need to do is create the political openings for them to do what they need to do.
And also let them believe that that's a route, because if you think that nimbleness is only possible in the private sector,
then you're already consigning yourself to a certain set of outcomes.
Yeah, and actually you'll be stuck with one of these monoliths who will then repress what you do.
I quite agree. Yeah. So I think there are just enormous funds of knowledge that can be won by doing work on the actual histories of these processes. And so today, we don't have the hindsight of looking back from 50 years, and I don't know where they'll all be located, but that there are things going on, presumably both in the companies and in some of the government units, and probably in the academy, and probably also in places we're not as familiar with, like maybe some NGOs. There are people working on things who do have a sense of a different way of doing it that might actually empower more people than just spouting the stuff about, give them access.
I've got some sympathy. I mean, I'm often harsh about Google, but I have quite a lot of sympathy. I think they're a very interesting company.
Yeah.
Anyway, very interesting. But I once heard Astro Teller, who heads their really experimental lab, this Far Outs, where they do what they call their moonshots.
Yeah.
That's a strange metaphor, but we'll leave it for the time being. But he said something rather interesting, because somebody was challenging him about what is Google doing spending all this money on this stuff.
Yes.
And their official position is that as long as 1 in 100 of these projects works, then we're happy. Okay, that's a 1% kind of success rate, and in Wall Street that doesn't cut any ice. But he had a very interesting take on it, because he said that that's Google, happen to exist now in a world that has become pathologically risk adverse. For example, he said no government in the Western world would now do something like build an internet. Because the internet was all built with public money at the beginning. And no commercial company, almost no big commercial company now, even the biggest ones, do blue sky speculative kind of research. There's nobody, to its credit, Microsoft does it. But nobody does anything like what AT&T did with Bell Labs over all those years. So he said, nobody's going to do this stuff. Nobody's going to do the really far out speculative stuff. And we happen to be in a very fortunate position. We have, first of all, we are a giant attractor for technological and engineering talent. So we get the best people in the whole world. And they just want to come with us. That's point A. B, and he said, we have this money pump, which just brings in this money every month. We have colossal amounts of revenue. And he said, well, then the thing is, well, in those circumstances, why the hell wouldn't we do things? Because nobody else is doing it. And there's a sense in which that's true.
Well, yes, but I mean, I think I'll play your alter ego and be the bad cop on Google for a second. I think they win an enormous amount by cultivating an exceptionalism, a corporate exceptionalism that lends them enormous cachet. I mean, great, even beyond the salaries and the meals that chefs serve up and all that. They have this sense of being a rule breaker. And so this adds to it. And without taking away from the fact that it may also generate interesting developments, I mean, I think what we really desperately need is what we've needed for arguably 100 years, which is ways of having democratic mechanisms for scientific and engineering decision-making. And those, in my opinion, don't exist, by and large. So that there is this deniability about, well, let somebody else who's equally expert as I, do whatever it is that needs to be done over there with politics.
Further down the line.
Or another, an ethicist. Let's have an ethicist.
But, they always bring them in at the end as well.
Well, that's true.
Don't stop us until we've got... And then, by all means, come and tell us if it's good.
That's right. So, but I mean, I think this issue has been around and around and around. It's not well understood. If you go back to the history of the National Science Foundation in the U.S. context, and I'm sorry in a way to be so ethnocentric, but it's the thing I know, so I can talk about it. The National Science Foundation is a crucial institution in the organization of U.S. science in a variety of ways. And there was a political debate that became really deep in the period from around 1945-46 to when the NSF was actually founded. I believe it was 1950, but it might have been a year or two off. There was a deep debate over what sorts of responsibilities should attach to public money in science. And the winning position, which was espoused by Vannevar Bush, whose name you will know, was that there should be none. It should be something where it was only panels of experts talking about who was the smartest and whose solution was best and so forth. And I'm not against having the smartest solutions, but it's not about that. It's about what democratic accountability needs to be put there. And the other position, which was espoused by a couple of, by then increasingly isolated New Dealers from states like West Virginia and Texas, I think was another one, they argued that the projects that the NSF undertook to fund should have civil application. They should be oriented towards lifting up the American population in a variety of ways. And one could always argue, well, it shouldn't be this way or it should be that way. But what they were talking about was a mechanism of democratic accountability, and it got hived off.
Okay.
So we can do this. I mean, it's not something that can't, it's been tried. And I wouldn't think that we should do it in some slavish mimicry of the previous way. But we have the resources to think in these ways, but we systematically starve them by saying, well, anybody on this side of an arbitrary line can't possibly be part of a solution.
So it bugs me that, if I could also jump in, that Googled thing that states are pathologically risk averse, as though this is a pathology of politics. States are as risk averse as their environments allow them to be. The reason that they were less risk averse is because they thought these existential threats that required them to throw money at them. And there's a huge kind of political environment around all of this. And it is part of that rhetoric which says states have got stuck. They're they're stuck in this pathology of politics, and we're going to go round it. States are where politics happens still, and you can't just hive all that off.
And actually, even in the case of the net, I mean, the origins of the internet project stem from the Sputnik launch by the Russians and the fear of the United States of being left behind in the space race, and it was a government response to a fear.
Risk and fear go together, and it's difficult to understand the relationship, but it's important to understand the relationship.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's gone away. I mean, I think you're quite right that today there is a very, very contentious undertaking, which again I'll mention briefly tomorrow, to transition the so-called IANA functions, the Internet Assigned Numbers Administration functions, to a
stakeholder group.
Multi-stakeholder group. And this is very much a political process, and it will be a political outcome if that actually happens, which I am in some doubt about that the U.S. will actually end up relinquishing it. But it will then have potentially paradoxical consequences, because if indeed corporate actors become vested with these political responsibilities, which, as I've said, I'm not certain will happen, but if it happens, then they will also become responsible for the politics, and there will be things that follow from that they do not want. So we'll see, but you can't act as if just because they've had it easy in a certain sense for the last however many decades and have been able to proceed as if the politics is over here and irrelevant and it's not, doesn't mean that will endure. And I think
well, if we know anything, we know it won't endure. It's just what will be the condition under which the two worlds come together. It won't be a war, we hope, but it will be something to do with that combination of threat perception, risk aversion, and money.
Well, one of the interesting things about the Snowden revelations and Snowden as a phenomenon is that it provided an inkling of where that critical and hopefully creative tension comes. It's too early to say now whether it will have that effect, but something has to change.
Well, I think large parts of the world think so, and we'll see, what kind of a difference that makes. This meeting just occurred between Xi Jinping and President Obama. I presume has some bearing on the discussions that we're now having, and we won't be able to see the full result of that probably for some time. The initial reports that I've seen are not as fearsome as I had feared they might be, in the sense that there seems to have been some sort of back and forth rather than just setting it out as it's this and nothing else. But
just tying together that with your thought about the fact that a lot of things happen largely in the past have happened largely in the past because of wars.
Or fears of wars.
Or fears of war. Well, I mean,
rival powers and
and you mentioned the South China Seas, which is, in a sense, if you'll pardon the expression, thinking kinetically, but in fact the big risk probably is warfare in cyberspace.
Yeah.
And that's a really serious proposition, I think, now. And that's one of the things that is on the agenda for the discussions between the Chinese.
Well, it's on the discussion so far. Again, it's not clear exactly what details have been decided, if any. But the signs are, at least nobody said absolutely not, that we'll have some sort of discussion going forward about this, which I think is desirable. You're quite right, but to make a line again between the cyber war and the kinetic war is incorrect in my view. They're intertwined. So the minute you have, I mean, when you have, let's say, traffic lights that are software controlled, then when you have cyber war, you have pileups. You have people who can't get to hospitals. You have, potentially all manner of things that occur to real physical bodies. And so I don't think it's yet been, I mean, again, we have this partial sense, it's utilities, it's transportation systems, it's banks, but all of that seems denuded
Nebulous,
of any
yeah.
kind of human involvement, so that it's just these big institutions. And it's a problem, but it doesn't really have to do with people dying.
Okay.
And I think it will.
Okay. On that gloomy note,
Oh, goodness.
I think we should stop. Dan Schiller, thank you very much.
Well, it's a pleasure. We'll be less gloomy next time.
Okay, you're on.